to start. And I'm going to do something here. Where did we leave off? We were talking about the structure of the church. Or we were talking about, we were looking at ordinations. We were looking at the ministers of the church, and we kind of stopped there. Did anyone want to cover any more with ministers? Or do we want to go to structure?
I'm good with going to structure.
Okay with me.
You know, I think the three of us that are here are pretty well versed in the ministry.
Yeah. We probably also know the structure fairly well. So were there any questions or thoughts when you read about the structure? Anything jump out at you?
Well, it always kind of amazes me that they sort of built the United States Congress after the early church.
Right.
You know, Episcopal Church. That.
It's a little chicken eggy which one came first, but.
Well, it was the same people who did it. I mean, literally.
Right.
I like to say, I like to picture them sitting in one meeting room in Philadelphia and finishing the meeting and getting up and walking next door to another meeting room in Philadelphia and talking about the government or the church, whichever way they went. I don't know. So we have that structured. Let me pull this up. Here's the things we have. I'm talking about polity. So yeah, I always thought it was funny that we're named, our church shares a name with our polity, which is kind of funny. It just describes how we operate.
The always interesting thing to me about polity is, yeah, we're Episcopal in polity, but in lots of ways we're way more congregational than any other Anglican church body. And a lot of churches tend to function that way in their thinking, I found. And some of that comes back to the fact that they had to have a church before there were bishops available to have oversight. So there's some of that baked into our founding.
Yeah, there is, but I mean, I guess we have representation in the sense that we elect a vestry who can vote and speak on behalf of the congregation, yet the congregation itself does not make decisions.
Right.
I mean, at a certain level, I mean, certainly there are things that you do that you want the congregation's support on.
But you know, in the Lutheran tradition, even though Lutheran congregations think they have more say in most decisions, other than voting on a pastor, which has usually been recommended by the church council, they don't exercise much of that authority that they think they have. It's usually the church council that makes most of the decisions for the congregation, and the congregations that I belong to, which include some pretty large ones, seem just fine with that.
Yeah, I think where it can get, I've always thought the Presbyterian church was a little squirrely the way they did things. With the presbytery being made up of both presbyters and lay, which I guess could be akin to our diocesan convention or general convention, but they seem to wield a lot of power, those presbyteries, into what specific parishes can do. mean, I guess our bishop can tell us as a parish, you can or cannot do something. But the other parishes in the diocese can't come and tell us we can or can't do anything. Where it seems to me that in the presbytery they can. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So when I was in Florence, when we were looking at the blessing of same-sex relationships this was 2015, before General Convention, before the canons were changed, you know, it was up to the parishes individually to decide whether they wanted to allow it or not, right? So we met in deaneries to have a presentation from a council with the diocese to talk about it, but it was up to each congregation individually to decide whether they did it or didn't do it. But I had a good friend in town who was at First Presbyterian, which was Presbyterian USA, and they wanted to do it, but the presbytery told them no.
And
even though the parish wanted to do it, the presbytery said no.
And it took action in 2015, because up until then it was, you were at the, mercy is not the right word, but your bishop could say yes or no, and the bishop said no, and you couldn't do it in the Episcopal Church until
That's true.
2015.
The bishop could say yes or no. Our bishop let each parish decide on their own. I guess that was his way of dealing with it. But there were some dioceses where the bishop said unequivocally yes or unequivocally no.
I still haven't heard what's happened to Bishop Love in Albany. I don't think that court's made a decision yet. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard anything on that either. So it's interesting. I mean, polity is funny how we all have our different ways of doing it. But even the curriculum itself says, even though we're Episcopal and we're governed by bishops, we're still, you know, there's only so much a bishop can do. There are some things the bishop does not have the authority to do that can only be done through acts of convention, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bishop can't. One example, bishop can't form a new congregation on his own hook. It has to be admitted into union with the diocese. And that can only be done by a diocesan convention. Not even the diocesan council can take that action.
Well, unless you're
in this diocese, for example. Yeah. So
unless we're the Bishop of South Carolina and decide to screw it and do it anyway. So.
Well, okay. Theoretically, I can speak to West Missouri specifically.
The old Diocese of South Carolina.
Right.
So interesting to me when we get into diocesan policy. Obviously, we have diocesan convention made up of all the clergy of the diocese and elected or appointed, or however each parish does it, lay people from the diocese, and that's based on the size of the congregation. Tells you how many you get, and even that, some dioceses do it a little differently, how they figure that out. I'm not sure how it's done here. In Alabama, it was done by the membership reported on the parochial report. So they determined how many you got.
Same here. I don't think that's changed, and it's 1 per 100 or fraction. Then it gets 1 per 250. So it's steps up a little bit. The St. Andrews has 10 delegates to the convention. That's the highest number in our diocese. No congregation can have less than 1.
And is there a cutoff?
No, it's it's like 1 per 100 of every major fraction thereof, up to 250. Then it's like 1 for every 250. I don't remember the exact formula, but no, there's no cap on the number that you.
One of the things we did, and this was a decision we made at a diocesan convention in Alabama, was we capped it at 8 because there was a concern that if we didn't cap it at a number, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Huntsville would run the show, and everyone else wouldn't have as much of a voice. So they kept it at 8.
but I can speak to deaneries, but in our diocese, Northwest Metro has about 40% of the lay delegates, Southern Deanery has about 40%, and the Central Deanery has about 20%. And that's only because I'm the secretary and I'm a numbers guy, and I like those kinds of facts in my arsenal.
So there is a little imbalance there with the Central Deanery. Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah. And it's just the Central Deanery is simply smaller churches that are mostly one, in some cases 2 or 3 representatives, but I don't think there's a Central Deanery church that has more than 3.
Right. Right. Well, and that's fine as long as decisions at convention aren't being made that show favoritism towards larger demographics, that sort of thing.
I won't speak to that because that's an opinion, and other people may have other opinions about that. So
yeah, I think every diocese is different how the politics play out. Once you get to that. I know in Alabama we always felt in Florence no one paid any attention to us, which in some ways was good. But in other ways it's like, well, we're actually doing things, but you don't pay attention to us. And I suppose here there can be some of that where Kansas City or Springfield get a lot of attention. So, anyway, so there's that. Between conventions, we have diocesan council and the standing committee, which do their work. On the national level, we have general convention, which is made up of deputies from all the dioceses, 4 clergy, 4 lay from every diocese in the church, and that's a set number, so everyone gets the same representation. And they're the only legislative body we have for the national church. And in between conventions, we have the executive committee that they can't do legislative work, but they can, what do? They pass something.
Just like diocesan council, between the general convention passes a budget for 3 years, the executive committee can make interim changes to that budget, right, and does. They do some stuff, but it doesn't have the same weight as anything by general convention. If they were to say that smoking is bad at the executive committee level, the general convention could say, no, it's really not. It's that kind of level of
right.
It's that kind of level of what they can and can't say on behalf of the church as a whole. The general convention is the highest decision-making body within the Episcopal Church. There is no court of appeal above that in any way, shape, or form.
Right. So when you look at our overall structure, we have the parish church, which is part of a diocese. The diocese being the largest geographical body under the direction of a bishop. But within the diocese, we have what we call deaneries, or sometimes convocations, which are made up of a clumping of parishes within a certain area, like we're the Northwest Metro Deanery. Then dioceses band together to form provinces within the church. We're part of Province 7, I believe.
That's correct.
In this diocese, which lumps us with like Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, among some other places. And so there's work that's done on those provincial levels. And then you have, from there you go to the national church, and of course General Convention being our legislative body that meets every 3 years. And we talked about this a little bit before, but the way that we elect deputies for that is at diocesan convention, and typically the one that would occur, I guess, two years prior to General Convention.
They have to be elected at least a year before the General Convention date.
Yeah.
In our diocese, that puts us about 18 to 20 months before the convention.
Right. So if convention is to be 2021, you can't do it at convention 2020, but you would have done it at convention, probably this past convention in 2019.
We did, yes.
Yeah. And that's done, and every diocese has maybe a slightly different way they do that. It's either an all at-large slate where anyone can be nominated and elected, or it can be done in districts within the diocese. That's how, and Curtis, I think we've had this conversation. That's not how West Missouri does it, but
yeah. One election, anybody can run. Majority on you have to get the majority of votes on a ballot to be elected.
right. Well, the way we did in Alabama is we had 3 districts, and so we would elect 1 deputy from each of the 3 districts, and then the 4th was elected at large. And again, dioceses have the right to structure that the way they want to do that. So they serve a general convention. Then, and that's sort of the highest level we have there. Then, as a national church, we are one member of the Anglican Communion, which I believe has 38 autonomous provinces. 38, 39, something along those lines.
Not sure that there hasn't been a 40th one admitted recently, but it was a blurb I read. I don't know that I'm saying that for sure, but.
Well, last time I looked into it, it was still 38.
Right.
Autonomous provinces that make up the Anglican Communion, and those groups get together, or used to get together, and maybe it will happen again, every 10 years at the Lambeth Conference, which is called by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is not, I repeat, not a legislative meeting, but simply a meeting of fellowship for bishops to get together to share ideas and talk about issues within the greater Anglican world. And it's become somewhat of a contested event the last couple times we had it. And it was on the 8th, so 2018 was when it was due, but it didn't happen because of still some unrest within the church. And it was supposed to happen this summer, 2020. I doubt it is.
It's been pushed at least a year. It was supposed to have ended this past Sunday, I believe. So.
Yeah. So that's, you know, and that was actually, if you know any of the history of the Lambeth conference, that was at the bidding of, I think, the church in Canada. The Anglican Church of Canada wrote to the Archbishop back in the 1800s at some point and said, can we have a meeting, and this was their words, of brother bishops from around the world in the Anglican Communion to talk about issues and such and all that. And I went to a thing when I was at the SEEP conference this year, back in February. I went to a seminar that sort of talked about the history of Lambeth. And they said in 1945, because it had been interrupted by the war, but in 1945, they held a Lambeth conference, I think it was. It may have been 46. And Hong Kong, the Anglican Church in Hong Kong actually brought before the group wanting to ordain women. So as far back as 1945, that was brought before all the bishops of the Anglican Communion, which I found interesting. I didn't realize it had been that early, that it had been brought up publicly like that. So that's been an interesting conference. But the guy who did it was Andrew Doyle, who's the Bishop of Texas, and he had all these cartoons from England for the various years when the Lambeth conferences would meet, you know, talking about, you know, every 10 years, the Anglican Church likes to air its dirty laundry in front of the public. I thought it was kind of funny. Other thoughts or questions on structure?
Not really on structure, but your last comments make me wonder, when were women finally ordained?
In the Episcopal Church,
Yes.
it was officially it was 1976.
Okay.
Unofficially, it was 1974.
Former retired Bishop of West Missouri at the time was one of the consecrators of the Philadelphia 11.
Really?
Wells, Bishop Wells was one of the consecrators. His daughter was one of the ordinands.
Ah, okay. So yeah, Jim, in 1974, there were 11 women ordained to the priesthood in Philadelphia, and it was called an irregular ordination because it wasn't allowed by the church. Yet it was done in the appropriate manner and done according to all the laws, yet the church did not yet allow for the ordination of women. And so they sort of, I mean, it was very public, and people were very aware of it, and it caused some controversy. And then in 1976, General Convention passed legislation for the ordination of women. And then shortly thereafter, that the ordination of the 11 was made regular. They didn't have to redo it. They just said, well, everything was done according to order, so yeah, now you're priests and you don't have to hide anymore. So that was in 76, and then of course our first woman bishop was elected in 1989, I believe. Barbara Harris, who was elected as a suffragan bishop of Massachusetts.
I remember reading about that.
And I have to say, as a kid who grew up with his dad as a priest, I only knew male priests. Even after 1976, I didn't know any. I hadn't seen any women priests. I didn't know any women priests. I'd only been around. Of course, my dad was my priest, but even all of his friends or the other people in the diocese, it was always men. So I can remember when I got to Sewanee as a freshman in the fall of 1988, there was a woman priest who was the assistant chaplain at Sewanee. And so that was new to me. And so, you know, I was getting kind of accustomed to that. And then Barbara Harris actually came to campus to speak in the spring of 1989. And maybe she was elected in 88. I can't remember. She may have been elected in 88. But this was in the spring of 89. And I remember going to this lecture that she gave, and the room was full of women priests. And I thought, where in the world did all these women come from? It's like they crawled out of the woodwork. I'd never seen so many women priests before. But of course, they'd been able to be ordained legally for, 13 years at that point. But having my father as a priest, I just never really was exposed to it at that point. Certainly am now, and that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. One of the first women that were ordained in West Missouri was Mary Chambrise, and she served at the cathedral for several years. But she's now in Kansas somewhere.
When would that have been that she was?
I think it was 77.
Oh, okay. So soon after it was.
Yeah, I think she was actually ordained in the Diocese of Kansas, but she was one of the first women to serve in West Missouri.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, she was, because it was at St. Michael's where she was ordained.
So, Joe, you're just joining us. We've gone from structure of the church to the ordination of women.
I caught the end. Thank you.
Okay, so here, as you can see what I'm sharing on the screen here, we've got a little bit on the Archbishop of Canterbury, and there's talking about Lambeth, the Lambeth Conference. So one of the things to remember, as I said, when we're talking about the Anglican Communion, that every province is autonomous, which means every province can decide how to govern itself. So we don't all have to pledge allegiance under the same person. And the Archbishop of Canterbury does not operate in the same manner that the Pope does for the Roman Catholic Church. So we do sort of look at the Archbishop of Canterbury as our spiritual leader, but he does not have jurisdiction anywhere outside of the Church of England. He's always been looked at as sort of the seat of the church, because Canterbury is the chair of Augustine is the spiritual home of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and then thus the Anglican Communion. So we like the Archbishop, and we listen to him, but he doesn't have jurisdiction. So you'll see here, down number 37, from time to time, the Archbishop of Canterbury appoints a commission to address particular areas of concern. One such commission is the Lambeth Commission. Most recently, the Lambeth Commission released a report called the Windsor Report. Well, it wasn't most recently. That was back in 2004, at the Windsor Report. But does anyone remember the Windsor Report?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the chairman of that was the Bishop of Armagh in Ireland.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And he was the oldest living bishop, longest serving bishop. That was the one thing I remember about that. But, and then the Windsor Report came out, and there was a call for a more hierarchical church, as I recall.
Yes, it came at the pressure. A lot of it was at the pressure of the Southern Cone, some of the African churches who wanted really to discipline the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church of Canada for ordaining, gay bishops. That's really what it boils down to. They want to be able to discipline them, and that's not how the Anglican Communion works. So there was this idea, remember, put out there to have this Anglican covenant in which every member of the communion would have to sign onto this covenant, but the covenant would then, as you said, in the hierarchical way, would bind you to this set of rules or discipline, and which is never how the Anglican Church has ever been set up, and it failed miserably. And a lot of people felt that that's kind of where Archbishop Williams kind of hung his hat, was to establish something to sort of try to bring us together, and it didn't work, and that's when he stepped down, and it's unfortunate for him. I think he felt a lot of pressure to try to do that, although I don't think he necessarily agreed with it.
Now, well, as I remember at the time, it was like some punitive measures were actually taken about kicking us out of commissions and
there was a
suspending our.
I mean, it didn't really mean anything, but yeah.
And the Episcopal Church voluntarily withdrew from a few things.
Right. To ease some tension.
To ease some tensions, but we never formally agreed to such a thing, and nobody ever formally took a vote to do such a thing, because such a thing was simply not permitted under any rules in any of these bodies. That just the Anglican Community Consultative Council maybe could have, but that's the only body that really possibly could have.
And they tried to make some reports out of these meetings that carried some weight, and they really didn't. They just were reports of the meetings. They couldn't legislate, just like Lambeth can't legislate. Anyhow, it's interesting. That's when the politics get involved. The politics
and church,
and the polity get mixed together. Yeah. For a church that was sort of formed out of politics in the first place. So I like this last line: Anglicans value staying together in relationship even when they disagree, and are united primarily by worship. That is true.
So where does Canterbury stand today on gay ordination?
The Archbishop himself, or the Church of England, or what?
Church of England is more, I guess, what I was thinking.
As far as I know, in favor of it.
Okay.
C of E does, but I don't. They may still have a moratorium on you cannot. They may. I don't. They may require chastity. I don't.
Yeah.
You can claim to be gay, but you cannot be in any sort of even a civil marital relationship, and that may be bad information on my part too. But that may be where they're at on that.
Somewhere back in my mind, I'm thinking that they ordained a gay bishop.
Yeah, I think they have.
Now, I don't know anything beyond that, whether or not he was in a relationship or, celibate,
And they also now have appointed a woman bishop.
Yes.
Several, yeah, which isn't very, I mean, that's relatively new for the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
I would say within the last 10 years.
Well, yeah, it's been within the last 10 years. I think it's less than, I want to say 5, but.
Yeah, maybe. I remember when I lived in England one summer when I was 10. It was the summer of 1980. And I think in 1980, the Church of England had just allowed for the ordination of women as deacons at that time. But that was it. That was as far as they could go at that time. I don't know when they allowed for priests.
Because, well, I know when Catherine, presiding bishop, went to the Lambeth conference, she was not allowed to wear her mitre. So, and that's not been that long ago.
Yeah, that would have been in
08.
probably in 08, yeah. Yeah, interesting.
So,
well, all right. So on to moral decision making. Did anyone get to read this section on moral decision making?
I did not.
I did not.
Well, then it's kind of hard to talk about without having read it. Is anyone familiar with Richard Hooker's The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity?
Well, I read it in college.
Okay. It's hard to get through.
That's exactly what I thought.
It's very hard to get through, but if anyone wants to read it, I do have it in my office and you're welcome to borrow it.
I'll remember that.
Yeah. But basically, Hooker lays out that, his three-legged stool method of scripture, reason, and tradition, and how we can use that for a theological reflection method within the church. How many of you have any of you done EFM?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. So you're familiar with theological reflection?
Yeah.
EFM, Education for Ministry, which is a sort of a class. I don't know if you'd say class.
I would, but then I don't mind school, so
Class for lay people within the Episcopal Church. It's a 4-year program, but the 4 years coexist together within your group. It's a small group that meets pretty much like in the normal school year times, once a week, September through May usually, and you engage in theological reflection, which is where you can take something like a happening in your life, and you have to be far enough removed from it that you can look at it with a little more objectivity, and you use scripture and reason and tradition as a way to sort of work through what happened and things like that. I really enjoy the method. I think it works very well, but it's done in a group setting, which is very nice.
Yeah. Janet is a graduate
Okay,
of
so
EFM.
she's done it as well.
Yeah, so I've sort of gotten the light version of it.
I think I've said this before, but when I was in seminary, as an entering first-year seminarian, we had to do a theological reflection. We had to have what we call TRG, Theological Reflection Group, that met in our first semester. But we also had to be trained as mentors for EFM before we could graduate. So I'm very familiar with the EFM program, although it has been updated since I graduated, which is a good thing.
Me too. I haven't. They've changed it quite a bit, but I don't know how far. But it
is a great program. I would love to see one get started at the cathedral. And I'm no longer a mentor. I'd have to get retrained, which wouldn't be that hard. But I really don't like clergy as the mentors. I think it's really more appropriate for a lay person or two lay people to be the mentors. I think it works better that way, but that's my opinion. Certainly there are clergy who do mentor, which is fine. It just, I think it works better when it's lay people. Well, let's move past this right now. You can go back and read about that. And the next section, engaging the world. How the Catechism describes the mission of the Church and identifying with the Church's mission. Mission is as the work of the heart. Mission is the work of the hands. Mission is the work of change. And mission is the work of the Trinity. This takes some pre-reading too to sort of get in a frame of mind to look at it. Let's deal with those two next time. We can talk about it a little more. And I'm going to go on to what I think is the next part. Well, there we go. Parts of a church. How about that? Let's talk about concreteness.
Okay.
And I'll have all these put up so you can get them too. This is just nice to have, so you can. And I know most of us are probably familiar with these things. Joe, the terminology is going to be pretty much exactly the same as it would be in the Roman Catholic Church.
I recognize these.
Yeah. So it's a nice way. And apps you're going to see a lot more often in a Roman Catholic style church because they tend to be, if you have more of a basilica style, is where you're going to get that apps. In our sort of English Gothic style, you don't have that as much. Although we do have that semicircular shape, but we don't really have a quote apse. Epistle side, gospel side. Now this is some terminology which I disagree with the way they have it laid out. The epistle side is simply the side where a lectern would be. The gospel side is the side where the pulpit would be. In a typical church, the epistle side would be the right side of the church facing the altar. So as you stand and look at the altar, in most churches, the lectern would be on your right, the pulpit would be on your left. But cathedrals are reversed. So in a cathedral, the pulpit's on your right, and the lectern is on your left. And if you remember the eagle lectern that used to be in the cathedral, it would have been on the left side, over by the font.
Well, it was actually in the area just to the left of the stairwell.
Yeah, but on that side, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily go just by this terminology. So we do call the pulpit side in the cathedral the gospel side. The other side is called the epistle side.
When I first started as an acolyte, which is over 40 years ago now, I grew up in a church where during the sequence hymn, after the second lesson before the gospel, we literally moved the altar missal from the epistle side of the altar to the gospel side of the altar.
Yep.
And after Eucharist, after communion been distributed, everything been cleaned up, you move the altar missal back to the epistle side.
Right.
For reasons that still escape me to this day. That was done.
Well, the reason being, and I do this, or we sort of still kind of do it, the way I have the altar laid out. It's to emphasize the two parts of the service, the sacrament of the word, or the liturgy of the word, and the liturgy of the sacrament. So when it's on the epistle side, you are emphasizing the word in the reading of scripture, and then when it gets moved to the gospel side, you're emphasizing what comes after the gospel, and that moves into the sacrament of Holy Eucharist. But then I don't know why it would get moved back again.
The priest told me to do it when he trained me, and that's what I did.
Yeah, well, that's what everybody did working out of the 1928 prayer book. That's just how it worked. So even now, you see when you come into the cathedral, we have the gospel book laid in the center of the altar. And then after the gospel is read, it gets moved off to the side so that the focus can be on the bread and the wine as we get ready to celebrate.
So as I recall, in our Lutheran heritage, about the turn of the century, more and more congregations they really did away with the lectern, and all of the reading came from the pulpit in many cases. Any similarity in the Episcopal Church to that?
Not well. The cathedral certainly is doing that, but I haven't seen that necessarily throughout the church, unless you're in a church or it's a new building that doesn't have a quote lectern or pulpit built, in which case they get one stand that can be called an ambo. That here's an ambo right here, a raised pulpit or reading stand that you would do everything from. At the cathedral, once the eagle lectern was removed, then the only place that made sense was the pulpit. So now we do everything from the pulpit. And I had thought about not bringing the eagle lectern back, but having another lectern built to put over there. But in consultation with some other people, decided there's really not a reason for that. We function just fine reading everything from the pulpit. So that's what we do.
It was Earl Kavanaugh that decided that everything, would be done from the ambo.
Right.
And that was, and he said, was to give it a particular focus. That, he wanted the word to come from one space.
Right. Yeah, and that makes sense. But some will argue that, the pulpit is for the preaching of the gospel, and that's the only thing it should be used for. But, when you preach, you also bring the other texts in too. So, why can't all and the gospel technically isn't even read from the pulpit. It's read from the middle of the chancel or from the middle of the people in the nave.
Mm-hmm.
So theologically, it is fine that all the word is proclaimed from the same spot and then preached on from the same spot. So that's you do see that from time to time, but I don't think you're seeing lecterns necessarily being taken away if they already exist. You just aren't seeing them put in if they don't exist as much. See the other things we have here. So here's one that gets me, is sanctuary. Technically speaking, the sanctuary is that space behind the altar rail, which would include the altar. You could say in the cathedral the sanctuary is specifically where the altar is and not necessarily all the way back to the reredos, but you could make an argument that it is all the way back to the reredos. But in some parts of the world, they refer to the entire building as a sanctuary, which I would say, well, no, it's not. Sanctuary is a specific part of the building. It's not the whole building. the whole building includes the sanctuary. But you also have the nave, you have the chancel, you have, X, Y, Z. And in the South, it was real hard to get around that. Because everyone refers to it as a sanctuary, even in the Episcopal Church. And when I was in Alabama, I had signs made. We renovated one of our buildings and a few other things on campus. And we had signs made to go up we had a breezeway that connected all the buildings. They're all separate buildings connected by this breezeway. We had signs made to put up at the entrances, to all the different entrances, and we had to determine, what exactly we wanted each sign to say, and symbols that might be put on it, such as, restrooms, things like that. And when it came to the church, there was kind of an argument as to what it would say. Do we call it the church? Because, the church refers to a larger thing as well, right? Do we refer to it as the sanctuary? Well, no, because it's more than the sanctuary. It's the whole worship space. All right. So do we call it the worship space? And we thought, well, that's going to confuse some people. So I think we did settle on the church, because that was a term that we thought people could understand. And I think that's what we put. So we put the church by that doorway. But it's interesting.
Why didn't you use the term nave?
Well, because it's more than the nave. The nave is simply the area of the church where the people sit. It's not just the nave, which, one thing that has bothered me at the cathedral is that we put in the registry book that took place in the nave, and it's like, well, but no, it didn't. It took place in the whole building. It's more than just the nave. It took place in the nave, it took place in the chancel, it took place in the sanctuary. But that's what the cathedral's done for years and years and years, so I didn't change that. So it's interesting, because the nave is particular. If something happens in your house, if you did it in the bedroom, do you write down that it was done in the kitchen? No, because I went in the kitchen. But the kitchen's a part of the whole house. Well, yes. But I specifically did it in this room. Well, I'm just going to write kitchen. That sounds ridiculous, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. These different parts mean they're different portions of the same space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And us liturgy types get hung up on that. for better or for worse.
So a funny story about sacristies that involves my mother. The church I grew up in had two sacristies, one on each side of the altar. One was the pastor's sacristy, and the other one being the altar guild's sacristy. And much like your description here, the altar guild sacristy was always referred to as the working sacristy. My mom took great pleasure on pointing out that the pastor's sacristy isn't really for workers.
And you'll hear some folks use similar terminology here between the clergy sacristy that's outside the nave / sanctuary proper, and then the working sacristy that's just off the sanctuary. You'll hear that terminology around our cathedral every so often.
Well, and that's terminology I've had to get used to since I've been there, because to me, the sacristy is that space that contains the vessels and the elements for communion, and any things like hangings and such. Where the clergy get ready is, to me, I would just call that the vesting room, because that's where we vest. So people would refer to it as the clergy sacristy, and I had to think a minute and go, what are you talking about? We don't have any chalices and bread back there. We've got mints. But now I understand. And that's just, that's what someone called it. And that's perfectly appropriate to refer to it as the clergy sacristy or the vesting sacristy, or however you want to call it. When I was in Chicago, we had one room that was the sacristy. It was a very large room, and it had everything. It had all the vessels, it had the red wine, it had all the vestments, it had all the, well, most of the hangings. It didn't have the frontals, but it had everything else. And everything was done in there, which was nice. And the altar guild would still lay out, we had drawers where they would lay out the vestments in the drawer. So when you came in to prepare for the service, you would pull the drawer out, and it would be all ready for you and laid out, and you put your vestments on, which was very nice. But as part of that, because when they lay it out, they use they put the chasuble down, and then on top of it would be the stole in the shape of an H, and then you'd put the cincture on in the shape of an S, and then you would lay the maniple on top of that in the shape of an I. So you get IHS being the first three letters of Jesus in Greek. But the problem is nobody wore the maniple anymore. And if you don't know what a maniple is, it's a thing that looks like a mini stole that's stapled together or stitched together at the end that would hang. Let me get where you can see me. That would hang over your wrist.
Okay. In the part of the undercroft, right underneath the sacristy, is a poster that shows what each piece is and where it's supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
In the preparation for it. Now, I'm glad it's there, but I can't really say that anybody has ever used it.
Well, we don't have a way to lay it out like that anymore.
That poster has been around since at least the early 80s, because there was one hanging up at St. Peter's, Harrisonville, when my grandmother taught me how to do the holy housekeeping, as she called it. So,
right. But has anyone seen a maniple? You know what I'm talking about? It would hang.
it
would hang over the wrist.
I've seen pictures, and I think I've maybe seen one clergy person wear one in my life.
And it serves absolutely no function at all.
Nope.
But it's representative of a towel, like as a servant, that you might have a towel around your wrist for what you need. But you can't use this thing because it's like a stole. And so what's funny is it was always laid out because it completed the IHS, but the rector and I would never wear it. So we would just dutifully lay it off to the side and then put the other stuff on. But it was always there.
Yeah.
Vestments here. It'll have one here. Oh, it doesn't even have the maniple on here.
Guess nobody else is using them either.
No one uses them anymore. Well, it's got Amish, which some people still use it Amish, but I don't.
Yeah. And I only know one priest who still wears a chasuble and then puts a thin alb over it, or not chasuble, a
cassock,
and then puts a thin alb over the cassock. Most priests now wear what's called a cassock alb, which is one garment.
Right. Yep. Yeah, it used to be you put the cassock on, then you put the alb went over your head and then buttoned up, and then the amice you tie around your head and put back so it looked like a hood. Mm. But now the cassock albs have, well, you can get them with hoods or not, but one of my professors at seminary would tell you, well, we shouldn't wear hooded albs because the hood it represents the monastic community. So only those religious members of a monastic community, like monks, should wear hoods. Hoods on the vestments, not academic hoods. So anyhow, you got that to deal with too.
Now, I was thinking that our former deacon, Brian England, had a different He may have actually worn a cassock and an alb.
He might
Yeah.
have. I know he always wore a dalmatic. He had his own dalmatic that was white. And so he'd always wear that dalmatic and would put his stole. It was designed so that he could wear his stole over that dalmatic so that it would be in that way somewhat seasonal. So I don't know if you're, I don't know that you're conflating a dalmatic with an alb necessarily, Rick, but he did have a very thin white dalmatic that he wore every Sunday.
Mm-hmm. I was ordained a deacon in a dalmatic, which you don't see very often anymore. But Diocese of Chicago required it for ordination to the diaconate. So I have a dalmatic. I have it in my vesting closet, and I think I let Jerry wear it at Christmas. I think he had it on. So it matched my chasuble.
I know we've got a dalmatic that, we've got a dalmatic that matches the festive frontal we have, that set that looks kind of like fires going all over it. We've got a dalmatic that goes with that, and maybe one or two others in our repertoire.
So anyhow, any questions on vestments or vessels or anything we use within the service of the church?
You know,
is the term readable ever used in the Episcopal Church?
Readable.
R-E-T-A-B-L-E.
Oh, yes. It can be used. What is your thought of it? Is that like what we might call a credence table?
My thought is it's in the Lutheran Church, it was what people didn't know what to call the altar that was attached to the wall when they started using a freestanding altar.
I think the word we generally use, I think, for what you're describing is reredos.
Well, reredos is, in my experience, was just more the fancy back.
The backdrop, yeah. This would be the altar itself.
I think
this was the altar table attached to the east wall, essentially. And in a lot of cases, when they went to take those off, they found out that it
they don't come off.
ruined the appearance of the reredos.
Yeah, I hear those called retables more than readables.
Well, it may just be a Scandinavian pronunciation.
Yeah. But I have heard use of it, but I don't really know that it's a common term.
now we've got the credence table that's in the sanctuary, and then we've got another credence table essentially in the chapel.
Right. Yeah, because you would have a credence table in the chapel because there's a separate altar in the chapel. But we utilize it even when we do it in the church, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the credence table is going to move this Sunday from where it normally is because we have a choir person sitting where it normally sits. So it's moving to right behind the altar. Then I don't have to walk throughout the choir to set the table. Well, all right. Well, then we will say the last two sections then, Richard Hooker's theological reflection and engaging the world for next week. And quite honestly, I think next week will be our last session. We will finish that, and then we are good to go. And once, Joe, at least in your case, when we get a date, when confirmation might actually happen and reception, well, I will let you know, and we can get all the proper documents taken care of and all that stuff.
Woohoo! Everyone's invited.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll be there.
And then what I'm going to do, I think, is take a break. So we'll meet next Wednesday, and then I'll probably take a break for probably 2 or 3 weeks. and then come back in right after Labor Day with a new something. I don't know yet what it will be, but we'll start working on something else.
Well, these have been good, Andy. I've enjoyed them.
Thank you.
Yes.